To welcome everyone to the third meeting of NTIA's multi-stakeholder process on IoT security updatability. We're still working on getting updatability entered in the dictionary. I know a couple of you reached out to us. That's the kind of work we try to do at NTIA. But while we're working on that, we're also trying to help with the broader security of the IoT ecosystem. And thank you so much for those of you who were able to come out today, and thanks to those of you who are watching remotely. We know that travel's really hard, and giving up a whole chunk of your day to discuss this issue is difficult. We really appreciate all the time you've taken. We're going to go over the schedule and get into the presentations in just a little bit, but first, I'd like to pass it over to my boss, the Deputy Associate Administrator of NTIA, and our fearless leader on all things cybersecurity, Evelyn Romali.
Thank you, Alan, and let me just second Alan's welcome to you all. It's really nice to see all of you. This is actually one of my favorite parts of my job, actually getting together with all of you who are actually making real difference on security in the ecosystem. So thank you for all coming. Thank you for all committing to this process. I know that some of you actually volunteer your time, and your companies and organizations volunteer your time, and we appreciate it very much, and we appreciate the work that you're all doing here. I usually spend my days in a lot of secure conference rooms, so when I can actually get out and see all of you and see what you're thinking about and how security is actually affecting your day-to-day, I really appreciate that. So thank you again, and thank you for your commitment to voluntary processes. We at NTIA are very committed to that as well. So let me just jump in and give a little bit more history about the process as well, and talk a bit about our expectation of our partnership here, and talk about where we're going. NTIA believes that an open, transparent, consensus-based process that brings stakeholders from across the digital ecosystem is one of the best paths forward to addressing important security issues in a realistic and timely fashion. Since we launched this multi-stakeholder process last fall, 4 working groups have been toiling on their chosen areas of focus. The goal of this meeting is to share your work and collect feedback from one another. Now is also the point in the process where we begin to develop a shared idea for the outcomes of this process, determine the best audiences for those outcomes, and strategize on how the outcomes can have the greatest impact. Following the publication of the Department of Commerce's Internet of Things Green Paper, which I'm sure everyone has read, we put forth an RFC requesting comment on the paper. Several of our multi-stakeholder participants contributed comments to that RFC, and we thank you for your insight. We have been reviewing those comments and considering next steps with our leadership. Securing the Internet of Things remains a critical issue across the U.S. government. We at NTIA are working hard to coordinate with our colleagues at NIST, the FTC, DHS, and across the government on how to address this large and growing issue, and exploring how to give security experts and industry leaders a strong voice in identifying and developing solutions. Furthermore, as you no doubt well know, IoT security transcends national borders. The issue has the attention of other governments and organizations around the world, and we've been working hard to collaborate with those constituents as well. Those of you in this room and those of you participating remotely are working hard to demonstrate that solutions can and should start with collaboration between the experts in the private sector, the security community, and civil society. We thank those of you who have contributed thus far and appreciate your continued commitment to this effort. And with that, I'm very much looking forward to hearing where we are. So thank you, Alan. And I just want to acknowledge the great NTIA team who has worked on this as well. Alan Friedman, Fearless Coordinator, Megan Dosher, and Travis Hall. So thank you, and let's get started.
Thank you, Evelyn. So I see some new faces in the room. That's fantastic. The goal today is to try to get as much feedback as we can on what we've been building and figure out how we can move forward quickly, but with full consideration of every perspective. So our approach to technology policy is that we need to hear from every part of the ecosystem. And we have in the room great engineers. We have pretty good lawyers. We have some fantastic policy experts. We have advocates. And the solution to this issue isn't going to come from any one of us, but from all of us together, we think that we can make some real progress today. So don't be shy about chiming in, about weighing in on what you think. Those of you who are on the phone, we're going to work very hard to make sure that you can engage. So we have two ways of remote viewing. One, there's a live webcam, which if you can see me, you're watching. Thank you for that. There is also a call bridge. The details are on the NTIA website. And when it comes to audience participation time, you may want to call. We apologize. There's about a 2-second lag between the call and the video stream. The internet still is the internet. So we're going to work on that. But if you want to chime in on this conversation, hit *1 and you'll be in the queue. We'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you're having trouble, please back channel through someone in the room, or you can email me, afriedman@ntia.doc.gov, and that way we'll be able to have as productive a conversation as possible. So walking through the schedule for today, we're going to be hearing from the 4 working groups. We're going to start off with technical capabilities, walking through what are the actual steps of an update and how do they map to the capabilities of a device. We're going to be thinking about technical standards, what's already out there that we can build on. From the technology side, we're going to pivot towards the consumer approach. How do we communicate this update question? And then finally, we're going to look at the thorny issue of policy, barriers, incentives. How do we actually make this vision and from something that we're talking about in this room to out into the wider world? So we're going to have presentations from each of these 4 working groups. They'll give a short presentation. We've got 45 minutes. That should be plenty of time for discussion. If it runs a little longer or shorter, that's okay. We're fairly adaptable here. And there'll be a lunch break from 12:30 to 1:45. There are a number of great places nearby. Some of you who used to work in this area might be able to help point folks to particular places for lunch. After lunch, we'll pick it up with the final working group presentation, and then we're going to have a broader discussion trying to sort of zoom out and say, okay, based on the feedback we've heard today, what more do we need to do, and how do we get to our target audience? How do we sort of think about aiming this towards a wrap-up, and what is that going to look like? So with that said, again, if there are any questions, feel free to chime in. If you're in the room and you would like to speak, I'm going to request, and we'll probably all have to remind each other to push the microphone button, and that way the folks listening at home can hear you, as well as you'll be more audible in the room itself. So with that, let's hear from the technical capabilities group. Srinath, you want to come up and we can load the slide deck for you to talk? It's not. It should be on the desktop. It's on the desktop. Yes. So thank you. Give us just one moment. So yeah, it's on the desktop. And I can drive for you while we do it from here, or you can do it from the podium, whatever you. Great. Yeah. The floor is yours. Yes. All right.
Hello. Yeah, my name is Srinath. I'm in Indian Technologies. I'm working with this AI group. Capabilities to up in the field. We were working from last 4-5 months on this particular stuff, putting all categories in the devices and all this stuff, and having a very good conversation in each. So we have put together some stuff. We're still working on. This is work in stuff. So what is this work group background is like, what we are thinking is approach. It is not like one person presenting and providing stuff and we need to accept kind of a thing. So it's a shade. You bring your ideas. We will discuss those ideas. We will see what are the positive aspect of it, and what are the constraints if you want to implement that kind of a stuff. Things based on those stuff. And we will say, for example, the device categories, there are devices in the field which are computing constraints one, or maybe some of the devices are very critical in the infrastructure where that definitely requires kind of a very secure mechanism to make the updates. Whereas a small device, for example, in a home kind of an environment, those kind of a devices may not be able to make the updates securely because of the computing constraints and the crypto constraints and the power constraints and all those stuff. So in that way, we did the categorization, and then we are trying to say what is called a scalable security approach can be made here. So that's the first thing, make a list of all those things and make a baseline for these updates. Then the steps of an update and the necessary technical capabilities. Yeah, this is what I'm already mentioning at the second point. This is the desired outcome, what we are planning. If there are anything we need to add, we can discuss that. The goals and audience, here it is, it's everything is voluntary. There is no membership, nothing kind of stuff here. And we are not making any kind of a recommendation or it needs to be implemented kind of a thing. And there is no regulatory, this one also. It's all non-regulatory, and it is what we call it as a guidance. Or up to a certain extent, we can call it as some kind of a recommendation for the implementation of the security kind of stuff. And the second point is very interesting. So when we are doing we bring in new technology and introduce new stuff, that should not pose any risk, security risk. Just to give you an example, okay, now we are connecting all devices into the network. Can I connect all the devices into the network, including the very critical infrastructure kind of a thing, to an external regular internet? That may introduce some security risk. If you want to do that, you may have to address some of the issues or vulnerabilities that may be able to come up. This is mainly all this guidance and those things we covering aimed at IoT device manufacturers, solution implementers, system integrators, and also the deployment and maintenance people. Because when you talk about kind of an update of the system, that means in some cases the maintenance people, they would be able to deploy and maintain the system. So that means you have to have a capability to who can do the update, the person, the automated system, or over the network if you are doing all this, what we call it as end-to-end security. For example, the person who wants to develop the new firmware, software configuration, from that, he will throw that from a remote location, he wants to update in the field. That means the channel from remote location to the endpoint, the complete path should be secure. If any point, if you miss something, that's a vulnerable channel. The scope is, we restricted our scope. Can we do all the devices which is sitting in a physical, secure location and all this stuff, or it is not connected devices? We decided to have the scope limited to connected, remotely addressable devices and systems. If you are within a lab environment or within a physical secure environment where you can do a update of the device or update of the system physically, then we are not considering that. That means we can use a different secure mechanism or safety mechanism. We know who is doing that. Our authorized person will be doing the update. So we are not covering that part of it. We are considering the remotely connected devices and systems. Yeah, we reviewed wide range of devices and categories, capabilities and use cases. we discussed several update mechanisms, both updated and human intervening. Although we talked about remotely connecting and doing it, in some cases, some of the devices in the remote, uh, the end-to-end path may not be feasible to have the automated stuff. In some cases, we may have to give some exception where in the end place, some manual intervention may be required because he has to personally has to verify that, validate this is coming from a trusted source, and then he can trigger the update mechanism. In that way, there may be some kind of manual intervention may be there. We mapped out the necessary steps, update process, including basic. We decided to make some kind of a category. One is the basic for any device, the basic necessity kind of a stuff. And then the other stuff is, it depends on some kind of a use case specific. So we made two different stuff. We will talk about that. There is a table prepared in that we can go on and discuss in that. In our discussion from last 3 to 4 months, we, like everybody will agree with me that there is no one size fits all model. I cannot take like, okay, I have a solution, I will go and implement this from a small, a $10 device to a multi-$1,000 systems. So we may have to, as I mentioned earlier, we may have to find a scalable approach to this kind of implementation. But although we say that it doesn't fit, but we cannot say that I will have 15 different types of mechanisms. So what we need to do is we can sketch out the components of update that fits the general use case. You make a basic general case kind of a thing. This needs to be done. Okay, the basic thing is, okay, I need to do a kind of an authentication and authorization who is doing that. Then next level, do I need to communicate? Do I need to encrypt this data kind of a thing? Again, it's a use case specific. Then the next step is, do I need to do it in a secure communication channel or normal channel is okay? If I encrypt and do the integrity measurement kind of a thing in the packet which I'm sending, can I send over a plain channel without without securing that particular channel, or a special tunnel kind of a secure tunnel is required or not? These are all use case specific. So we can increase the level of security by doing step by step. And also when I'm using, do I need to for doing the authentication and encryption, do I have to use standard crypto algorithms, crypto mechanisms? What is the key size I have to use? What type of algorithm I have to use? RSA, elliptic curve, what key length I have to use? This all depends on the use case and application use cases, and what is the value you are protecting. For example, if you are protecting, I will take an example of a smart meter where you are protecting the signal, the price signal of a kind of a thing. When you're transmitting that kind of a information, you need to be very careful because that's a money. So the value you are protecting. So in that case, you may have to think about encrypting that kind of a data with a crypto mechanism. So this is where this is not a one solution approach, it's a multi-stage or multi-phase approach we need to take. Yeah, different use cases in security context will have different security needs, specific additional features to update. Based on this, we may have, that's where I'm re-emphasizing that scalable security solutions need to be decided. Next. So the basic end use case, we attempted to establish what might be seen as the minimum one. All these were driven by people brought some use cases and we discussed all this stuff. Some use cases will need further steps, like as I mentioned, some application and some use cases are very basic. We have to implement those things. On top of it, depending upon what value you are protecting, how critical that information is, how the device is used, what kind of application it's a nuclear facility or an electric grid infrastructure, or it is a financial sector bank, or it is just a smart home, your thermostat kind of stuff. Based on that, those kind of application scenario, you decide what level of security need to be implemented. Mapping between the components and technical. Yeah, so steps understood is a baseline for updates. Sorry, we discussed about some of the baseline, what we need to do, kind of updates, mapping between how we can map between the components and technical capabilities. When we say component, it is not only the physical component, we are talking about the logical software modules or the low-level firmware, booting of the system, booting of the device, some of the things, operating system, real-time operating system used in that, and application layer software which are running. We have to consider all these things when we need to talk about the implementation factor. So at this point, I'll stop now, and I will hand it over to Alan so that we can continue the. Do you agree with these kind of designations? Do you think anything is missing? And what are the appropriate next steps we can, over the course of the day, we will discuss these things. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. We're swapping out mics for a second, so I'll just use this for the moment. So we will try to pull up this handout that you should all have, which is a two-sided table that walks through what this working group has said. Here are the steps of an update. Give us one moment to pull it up on the big screen. This is why we have the handout, because the type's fairly small. Angela, I think we also, if we can, we're going to go into Q&A on the call line so that folks can chime in. And if we can open up the mics of, I think, Jason Wall and Tim Hahn, since they're part of this working group, if they have contributions to add in addition to into what Srinath just said about the working group. So let's start there in terms of if anything further to add.
Lines are open.
Yes, thank you. Hey, Alan, this is Tim Hahn.
Hey, Tim.
Hope you got. Yeah, obviously you can now hear me. I just wanted to reinforce that it was a good overview, and I think that the items that you see on the two tables are the things we've identified. There's obviously still more work to do, but I think they serve as a great understanding of requirements, or what we see is required for a basic update, and then additional items based on use cases in the second table.
Thanks. So now's the chance that both the room and those of you who are watching at home can chime in and say, here is why everything you've been saying is wrong. And so, yes, please, and just as a favor, for the first few hours of discussion, if you could just introduce yourself, if you like, say where you're from, so that folks can get to know each other in the room.
I'm assuming for those in the room, holding a hand up will be sufficient to indicate being in the queue?
Yes.
Okay, good. This is Ralph Brown. I'm the CTO of CableLabs. I had a question. When you talk about value in terms of what is being protected, are you considering not only direct value, but indirect value? And so let me pause there.
It is both. Direct value-wise, it's a cost, right? For example, that's why I gave you the example of a smart meter when you are remotely updating the price signal kind of a thing. This is a direct, this one. Indirect values are, for example, when you are updating the device through this one, you broke the channel. Somehow security attack happened. Now, when you happen that, some of the loss is the corporate which has deployed this kind of a stuff has a reputation is lost. For example, the update has happened, the target breach has happened, financially they lost, but at the same time the target also lost the brand value. So that's a brand value, and the brand, this one, it's not only brand, it can be applied to any critical infrastructure. For example, this particular power utility has done that, for example, If you take San Francisco area, PG&E are in the southern Texas or some other kind of a thing. They lose their brand value. That's the thing. The brand value is not a direct cost. It's an indirect one. So I will take that.
Okay, one of the things I would like to add is, so for example, in the consumer marketplace, there may be, one of the things I always like to say is light bulb. You know, how secure does the light bulb need to be? It has a processor, it has internet connectivity, it has memory. It's a computer, it has the capability to do various things. If it can act like a controller on the consumer's network, then there are ancillary value that gets hit. So for example, I can now detect, control the lock. I can now open the lock, I can access the home, and so the risk associated with theft could be a safety issue in terms of smoke detectors and other things like that. So I think it's very important to look at the other indirect effects, because that really is the value you end up protecting.
And forgive me, I'm going to chime in here as try to facilitate. One of the things that we found in these discussions is the broad issue of IoT security is a massive issue and very important. And one of the things we've tried to do to sort of target the conversation is to sort of focus on applying things to mapping it back to the software update question. So, for example, when we're talking about the value at risk, how does that change our understanding of updatability?
No, perfect. We can have an offline discussion too, one-on-one on this topic. On an overview, you're exactly right. I'm coming from a company. We provide the security solutions from a scalable approach. That's what the word I was using. I need to, nowadays, the same thing, the same question, LED it comes, light bulb, they are becoming intelligent. From my perspective, everything is intelligent, capable of communicating, needs to be secure. That could become just now as you said, a small device with, you may ignore the LED, but that has that kind of a capability that can steal the secret, safety issues, privacy issues, all these things can happen. So from that perspective, the answer is yes. But like as Alan mentioned, our focus was on the update. That's where I always bring in the scalable security. Yes, we need to identify that LED bulb. I need to identify the data. For example, I'll take a minute and complete the answer. For example, in a home, you have a smart meter, water meter, and gas meter, right? Do I need to have a same level of security for all three? No, we need to design in such a way that water meter and gas meter can identify itself as like a brand protection kind of thing. They can provide the data information in a local Zigbee kind of a communication back to electrical meter, whereas electrical meter can act as a hub in the home, this one, and that can communicate to, or a gateway built in your home can communicate to the outside world. In that way, the level of security required for water meter and gas meter is, I will say, low to medium, whereas your electric meter is a medium to high. In that way, the categorization comes into picture, device categorization.
Great. Do you have anything you wanted to add to follow up on this? So we've got a couple of questions on the phone. Angela, can we hear from Seth, who's been very patient?
Hey, Alan. Actually, I was just chiming in to complain about the mic, but I feel like that's been settled. No comment on the update process right now, but thanks for giving me the floor.
Thank you. Question in the room?
Hi, so I'm Justin Kapos, NYU. I have kind of like a bunch of questions here. I'm coming into this meeting a little late, and I want to apologize for this. But there's a lot of concerns that a lot of traditional update systems have, especially those that are designed for security have, that I'm wondering if they're not maybe adequately discussed in parts of the document. So issues like protecting against different types of attacks that seek to keep clients from obtaining updates instead of tampering with updates. There's different classes of those types of attacks. There's also attacks relating to the infrastructure itself. Historically, there have been a lot of major companies, Microsoft and Google and Fedora and Red Hat and Debian, and I could go on, that have had people break into different parts of their infrastructure and distribute malicious updates that way. And I am willing to bet that most IoT device manufacturers are going to have worse server-side infrastructure security than those major companies that I just discussed will. So it makes it even more important that they design a system with the understanding that attackers will break into parts of the system. So there are a few different types of update architectures that are meant to protect against this, including some that are even specific to IoT. So I would be happy to follow up and bring those to people's attention so that they can be added into more of the discussion. I want to pause here, and I have one other quick thing I want to say if there's no other.
Any reaction from Srinath or Jason or Tim?
Yeah, you're exactly right. So let me use the microphone. Yeah, you're exactly right. That's where in our discussion all these topics came up. One is the protecting the stuff is one is a kind of a license management kind of a stuff. Who can get access and who can do this kind of a thing. That's where it comes the authentication, authorization, access control, and how do you do that? And the channel, which I mentioned in my earlier presentation, that it's an end-to-end point security. From the firmware leaving in a server, that needs to be signed and verified, signed by a third-party CA so that it is not particular to staff. And then when it leaves there, and then the secure channel will take that to maybe a multiple hub, because we may have a multiple hubs, it may have to pass multiple servers. So all these servers, any point in the channel coming to the endpoint, for example, your thermostat at home, when you're trying to update, so the complete path need to be protected. And when the blob of data comes into the endpoint, that's where you verify it. Because it is signed by a crypto mechanism, you verify that integrity is checked. That means nobody modified anything in this one. And first of all, you establish a secure channel. Then you transfer everything. And when it comes to your endpoint device, where that credentials to verify that authenticity, that will be stored in a, for example, a tamper-proof storage. When you have that credential sitting there, which never leaves that particular tamper-proof storage, secure micro or a HSM or a TPM nowadays, when you do that, the verification happens within that secure micro, and then when it comes back, it decrypts and verifies that. In that way, you can securely do those stuff.
So I want to avoid getting too far into the weeds, but flag this, and love the participation. Please do.
Give me just 10 seconds. So Fedora, which was broken into twice, by the way, had exactly this design, and it didn't protect them either time. So there are things out there that I would love to discuss offline with you that I think should be a major concern.
Well, and I think that's you're raising a very important point, which is scoping the security question. Because as I understand you're saying is it's not just the device that we need to think about, it's the organization that is providing the patch. And traditionally, I think with this discussion, because IoT is such a big issue, we have said, the manufacture and development is going to be a separate discussion. But I'm hearing from you that at least the operation and maintenance needs to be part of it. Just a quick whip around the room. What do people think about that scope of saying we need to actually look at the organization or provider as well as the device manufacturer?
Hey, Alan, this is Jason Walls.
Jason, go ahead.
So my question for Justin, are you talking about securing sort of the location of the updates, sort of the file server system, or are you talking about also securing the API that can cause remote updates?
It's a little hard to hear you, but what I'm talking about is effectively what a lot of organizations do is they have different people in different roles that go and perform different actions, and these people have to have signed metadata in different steps of the process in order to get things out. And so these kind of policies and procedures are, over the last few years have become very commonplace in major technology companies and cloud providers and areas where security is important, including like automotive space has things in this realm, and I think it's something that is becoming kind of industry best practices.
Craig Spiesel, Online Trust Alliance, Internet Society. I think your point's valid. I think as we look at the problems, and I've been part of most of the working group efforts here, is there's a range of companies. And it is, as we look at patching, we need to look at the integrity of that patch, error checking and such. And we have found those are risk vectors. So I think we have to look at that. Alan, to your question of the manufacturer and such, the process. But I think the integrity of the patching is clearly something. But we also recognize that in the vast array of companies coming to market, there's a whole range. And when you say, well, metadata and different people, it may be the same person within a company. And so their processes of code development are very broad and varied. I think we have to recognize that. And so as we look at the framework, we need to identify those issues and hopefully that they adopt as many of these as possible. But clearly, we are at risk of the integrity of the patching process as well.
John, very quickly, and then back to Mark. Do you have a response? Yep, okay.
I was going to say, you raise a very important scope question. In our previous conversations, you've allowed that this is just one aspect of security within IoT. And so if you're trying to define that the scope of this work is really to guarantee the integrity of those updates, then I think that is definitely within scope. If you say it's just a matter of guaranteeing that updates take place, that's a smaller scope.
Thanks. John.
Yeah, hi, John Banghart with Venable. So I think that the question that I heard you ask, Alan, is whether or not the sort of things we're talking about here, broadly speaking, are in scope. And I think the answer is definitely yes. And in Working Group 4, which we'll hear about later today, we actually account for that. Again, very high level, but we actually account for the fact that there's software, hardware, service provider, different elements that all come together that may be different companies, different people, that all assemble to actually create whatever this IoT thing is.
Great. Just want to make sure if anyone has one more two-fingered contribution to this conversation, and then we can go to the phones. So we have James from Juniper. Angela, we have a question in the queue.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can now. Thank you.
Oh, okay. A question I have, maybe a policy issue, it may not. What you've done in this first part of this, or this first working group, focuses on the manufacturer and his process, or the developer of that device, how he updates it. What happens to either the government or the developer or whoever, the industry, to update the consumers to tell them that there is such a thing as IoT, IoT updates, IoT security updates, etc. And in that vein, for example, I have probably dozens of or more IoT devices sitting on my network in my home, and I block all paths in and out except those that I want allowed. How does now the IoT device tell me I should allow a access so that the developer, manufacturer, whatever, can download to me an update, or that I can send information back on my network? Because I own the network, not the service provider, not the IoT vendor, not the data processor. I own it, and I control that data. How do you get that information out? This is a consumer issue, really, but it is a technical issue that most consumers couldn't deal with.
So on the consumer issue, we're going to hear from that from working groups 3 and 4. But on the technical question, Srinath?
Yeah, so this is, again, that's a good point. So now you have, let's say, 10 or 20 devices at your home, but whenever you bought those systems, you must have been also signed up with something with some service providers. For example, you bought a thermostat, whoever installs that, maintains that, or your home appliances, anything you buy, service agreement. In that service agreement, you can make sure that mutual communication is possible. In the sense, as a consumer, you should be able to talk to the service provider. Those are all need to be defined in your consumer agreement. If you say that I don't care, that should be there in the agreement. I don't want to do any update to this one, fine. Or when the update happens, when the new firmware comes or the new configuration comes or something like that, then I should be able to do that. They have the authority. You have to authorize that. Consumer should authorize the service provider so that they can automatically do that, irrespective of what you are, kind of a thing. So those are the agreement you have to put in place.
Well, I can tell you as a response that most consumers do not use or read their user agreement, and they have no idea what you just talked about.
So that's where the service provider and all those things, they have to talk to them. For example, if your device is a risk to my network, I will penalize you, kind of a thing. You have to force. Sometimes you may have to force them. Because you are connecting to a network, and that's a vulnerable one, and that's a problem for the whole infrastructure, not only for you. Because you're not only compromising your device, the neighbor's device too.
And James, I just want to say that in terms of communicating with the consumer and having that be a bidirectional conversation, I think the work that we're going to hear later from Working Group 3 might have a lot to say about it. And if you don't hear what you're looking for, please chime in on that issue.
Okay, thank you, Alan.
Thank you. So I wanted to sort of focus on the document that we have in front of us. And for those of you who are on the technical bent, are there steps that you think we're missing? And for those of you who are on the policy side, how would you like to see this sort of document used in terms of, that's something that we've talked about in the group. And Tim and Jason, please chime in. But we have...
Sure. So Justin Kapos again. So I have a bunch of kind of specific technical places in the document. Is this the right form for me to bring this up, or is this detracting?
I think given your level of engagement and your particular expertise in this area, we may try to draft you into the working group okay. Perhaps over lunch, Srina and I can sit down with you. Does that make sense?
Yep.
And if people are very excited to hear this, we definitely want to. Can you give the high-level summary or a couple of very quick bullet points?
Possibly. Yeah, I think I gave kind of the high-level perspective a bit before, so it's probably easier. I did have one thing related to the way that risk is viewed in this that I wanted to bring up very quickly that was brought up in the initial presentation. Is, if that's okay while I have the floor, I'll just say something quickly about this, which is I think that that a discussion about is adding an updater going to add risk to a system. Well, anytime you add software to a system, you're adding potential attack surface. And so really I think the question is how do we make an updater that minimizes the overall risk of the product? Because not having security patches for a product is also a risk. And so that's, I think, has to be a fundamental way to think about it. And I think one of the really awesome things that that was said earlier by Srinivas in his talk was this discussion about one size not fitting all. People might need to pick and choose things that are appropriate for their environment. So I just wanted to kind of bring that up, that thinking about it as secure, insecure, vulnerable, invulnerable, whatever is maybe not the right way to do it, but instead to think about it about what are the risks and what's the best payoff we're going to get for the work we do.
Thank you.
Alan, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, this is Tim Howe. I just wanted to reinforce that last comment. I very much agree with that. Also, with the comments made earlier about, were certain things thought about, what about these issues? I think a lot of that comes out in, all right, when you pick a particular use case and you identify what you're going to do for that use case, then you need to do a threat assessment, threat analysis, risk assessment, evaluate all those risks and potential attacks. in what you chose in that specific use case or deployment. This doesn't get to that level of detail, but you have to get to that level of detail to address what is being mentioned.
Yeah, yes, we started discussing on that particular topic too. So what we said is these kind of threat analysis and vulnerabilities and attacks and the kind of a thing is been already addressed by so many standards and alliances already. That's why there is a list of what we thought was there is an organization targeted for review the standards catalog. So that comes from Industrial Internet Consortium, NIST, or Industry 4.0. All those organizations we listed here, there are already set of this threat model, our maturity model, capability maturity model, all those things have been already there. Moving forward, what we want to do is, that's what we were discussing in the last this one, there may be a, depending upon the members' contribution and presence, we should be able to go through, review these things and see, is there a gap in those things so that we need to add something new. Otherwise, we can go ahead and adapt that. For example, IIC recently developed a security framework document which covers most of the things what we are talking, maturity model, different use cases and all those stuff. We can refer to those things and use that.
Thank you. And in fact, a great segue into the second page of the document, which is additional components that might be relevant to use case. And that's something that the working group talked a lot about, is there's the baseline. You really can't call something an update if it doesn't have the first page. And then there are going to be features that just, if you are going to be demanded by context, to be accepted. And in terms of what the broader community thinks, you know, how useful is this, and how would you like to see it used? Would you like to see this embedded in more discussions of threats, or is this fairly substantial if we just put, if the group puts this out as, you know, turns the table into a document as a freestanding document? Is that something that's going to be useful for the community by itself? So I can tell you, the working group has been trying to figure that out themselves. John.
So I think, yes, it's useful. I think, at least for me, some use cases would also be helpful, right? So, you know, pick a couple of devices or whatever sort of ecosystem you want to choose, and then show how running through all of these different pieces, the first table and the second, and start making a little bit more concrete. I think there's plenty of folks in this industry that can look at this and sort of understand it, but I think there's a lot of folks who can't. You know, folks who may even be technical, working in the IoT manufacturing space, who may have never addressed something at this level of detail before. So I think you need to have a little bit more instruction around, here's what this means to this kind of device and the steps that would happen and why it's important, right? And we heard a couple of those pieces, but I think building that out some more would be helpful.
That's what I was mentioning. Some of these use cases and all those things have been done by other entities already. For example, Security Framework Group. I myself is creating all the set of use cases there. So those things we can refer, bring it back here, and we can review this together. Possible.
Great. Any further thoughts on how this can be used? So we got the idea of having use cases around this idea. Yes.
So this is, I'm James Simister from Panasonic, and one of the things that I was thinking about as I reviewed this list is the scalability. So, you know, one of the lines up there is transmit the updated code. That sounds really easy, but when you're talking about millions of devices in the field, there's a fair amount of infrastructure required to handle that. So one of the things we found is working towards having a nice scheduling capability to do that. And so I don't know if that needs to be discussed here, or maybe that's too far into the details, but maybe as part of those use cases that we were talking about, is to talk about what does this look like when we're dealing with millions of devices? You know, how does that play out? What kind of infrastructure is required for that? And what is required from the device side so that they don't inundate the infrastructure all at once?
So I'll just say one really quick thing, which is Microsoft actually published some pretty useful information about how they do updates and how their infrastructure works. So I'd be happy to point you to that offline if you're curious. As for whether this belongs in the document or not, I could see that perhaps it wouldn't, except for as an example of, hey, if you want to do this, then here's somewhere to look. But it doesn't, if done correctly, and if it's not a mechanism for people to indefinitely, to have, you know, a man in the middle indefinitely deny you updates, then it seems like it's more of a you know, performance tuning bandwidth issue than a security one.
Sorry, Alan, one last thing, I promise. This is John Banghart. This to me seems like something that would be great for NIST to work on at some point. I mean, this is the kind of thing that NIST likes to do, and you could foresee a NIST IR or something to that effect that starts to codify some of this. I think the community needs to work on it some more and refine it some more, but ultimately I think there's potential value there in that avenue as well.
Thank you. And in fact, stakeholders have been citing things like 800.147, which is BIOS firmware updating. So I think there's some engagement, and we know there's some NIST folks that have been tracking this project quite closely. Any further thoughts? Anyone on the phones want to chime in? All right. See, this is the joy, is you just have it silent enough so that, see, all you have to do is
I felt pressured to say something. Just, again, this is Ralph Brown with CableLabs. Just an offer as a resource, CableLabs has been doing device security for well over 20 years. Every cable device that connects to cable has elements of security and secure software download. All of our specifications are publicly available on our website. Certainly welcome to reference any of that material in terms of code signing, download process, all those sorts of things. So it's just a resource that we'd be happy to share.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yes, I have seen that. We also worked on the pay TV stuff, kind of a stuff. We have reference to the CableLabs spec, and we are part of it. We are aware of that. So that's where we can add that to our list here.
And for those of you who are in the room and those of you who are watching the webcast, there's still plenty of work to be done in this working group. So I think, you know, afterwards, please reach out. We'll add you to the working group list, and we can roll up our sleeves and dive into the nitty-gritty. All right. So I think in terms of this working group, I want to personally thank everyone who's involved in that working group. We've got Srinath in the room, but a lot of people who are listening and watching who's been working very hard on weekly calls. So thank you all so much. This has been a tough thing for folks to get their heads around, and this short presentation does not really show all of the work that went in to get us here. So thank you all for those of you who worked behind this. Now we are going to hear from the standards working group. We've got Matt and Angela. Can we open up Kent Landfield's line?
This line is open.
Great. Hi, Kent.
Hey, Alan. How you doing? Can you hear me?
We can indeed. Thank you. And we've got the slide up, and Matt is, or would you prefer to be at the up here? We can get you here, and that way we can just have the slides in front of you. There we go. So he'll just, oops, thank you. Just use this mic. That one might be a little easier, right? Yeah.
Okay. So this is a bit of a tag team effort. Kent couldn't make it today, so I raised my hand to be the person to present it. But Ken and I are going to kind of co-present this. He's going to jump in and add color as needed. I'm going to try to do my best at giving a readout on what the group did. The group's done a lot. So let's see. Go forward. Perfect. Okay. So the update on what the group's been doing. The group got organized at the first kickoff meeting back in, I think that was October. The scope of the group really is to kind of do a survey of the existing standards and best practices to identify what is being done in industry today and to ensure that any work that's being done by this multi-stakeholder group isn't duplicative of what's already out there to avoid reinventing the wheel. And what we're looking at is we're trying to go through the various standards, best practices, and anything that companies may be doing to kind of identify how you're doing upgrading, patchability, so that we can identify patterns and kind of synthesize and figure out, what's being done, and then also so that we can inform the group so that there's kind of a map or a catalog of things so that when people in the IoT industry are looking, there's a place that they can start as opposed to having to do all this work themselves. Is there anything you want to add that I missed there, Ken?
Yeah, you didn't miss anything there. The reality is that this is a very diverse environment, and we're finding consortium standards groups. We're finding small consensus groups that are working together to try to address this. In many cases, there's not a lot of detail. We'll get into that in a bit, but this is a very time-consuming effort to go through these documents and first off identify the organizations that we should be targeting, but then go through these documents. So what you're seeing here with the catalog that was sent as part of this effort was really trying to sort of codify what we had found and what we were investigating so that other working group chairs and working groups could leverage that information.
So on this slide, what we're showing in the group is not trying to boil the ocean, but as you can see, there are a lot of standards out there. Anybody who's played in the standards space knows that there are a lot of standards, but we're also seeing as new standards groups that are trying to address the IoT space as well, so that's adding to the list. So what the group did is we first tried to identify the standards first, so we've put together the big list. The group's gone through the ones on the left. We still have work to do on the ones on the right, so we're still looking for some help because, as Kent was just saying a moment ago, if you've ever looked at these things, engineers can write and produce documents right up there with all the lawyers. So we've done a good job at writing a lot of stuff. And when you go through these things, they're all different because every standards group kind of has a different style on how they put together their standards. So as Kent was saying, going through these things takes a bit of work because you got to figure out where to look in it. And we'll talk a little bit at the end about some of the observations, but what we've also found, and I think a lot of us knew going in, that there's no single section in any of these standards that will say, oh, this is how you do a software upgrade on a lot of these. There's some, and we're trying to pull those out to kind of as references and use cases and best practices to kind of zero in. There's some stuff in the broadband forum. I was talking to Ralph, I know in the CableLabs standards, we also talk about some of that. But so you have to kind of go through all these things. Typically there'll be a piece that says, we'll talk about like kind of what is the capability, then you have to go find something in the security section that will link it to how you do it securely, is often how it's done. So it's a big job, and what we're trying to do is go through and zero in and put in a catalog the specific pieces so that others who come behind us can come in and they know exactly where to go look. If you've gone, say, and looked in the 3GPP specs, you can spend weeks trying to find what you're looking for, and you might be in the wrong version because they're on what, version 11, 12, somewhere up there, and you'll be like in the wrong space totally. So it's a lot of work. Anything else there, Ken?
Yeah, the one thing that's sort of different from this effort in the IoT space is that it's very different from the standards perspective. In many cases in the past, you have standards development organizations or standard setting organizations that are there for creating quote unquote real standards, either national or international standards. In this space, there is a extremely large amount of consortium and industry alliance work that's going on. And so some of these cases, they're not really standards as you consider standards from an ISO or an IETF or an SDO perspective. They're consensus standards that the association the Industry Alliance is using and focusing on for its members. So it's important that we look past just some of the other areas. As you can see, a lot of these really aren't standards development organizations officially, but they are consortium groups that are working together to address some of the same issues we're trying to address. One thing I should note on this slide, when this was sent, I don't think the Broadband Forum was on there. Since the documents have gone out, we have had 3 different other efforts request participation. So that's a positive from our perspective, and they'll be added to the research pending list. It's always easier when we have folks from within those organizations assisting us. It makes it much quicker when they can get right to what we need, as opposed to the gumshoe kind of approach that we've had to go through in digging this stuff out. Matt?
Great. Yes, and hopefully we'll get some other people step up and help too. So a couple things. So we're still kind of zeroing in what we want to deliver, but I think kind of what we think we want to do is, the first one is we're putting together what we're calling a catalog, where we're kind of, as I said, collecting all the things that we've already pulled together, make it an easy to read, kind of zero in on the different places of what is the section in the specific specification, standard, best practice, or consensus document that you are referencing, so that you can go find it easy. We have something in a draft form that we've been using to work off of. The second thing, kind of as an internal document for this stakeholder group, we are looking to put together potentially something that will capture the observations that we've seen so far to help inform the other working groups going forward, so that they can use that as well. So maybe like it's kind of like a crib notes version of everything that we've discovered. So that's kind of what we've laid out, and I'll show you on the next slide kind of what the catalog contains, but let Kent jump in here as well.
No, I think you did a good job there. Thanks.
Okay. So I've signed up to write this thing, right? So just real quick, this is kind of what we're capturing in there, so you can kind of see. I think that the key thing in my mind was we were kind of capturing what is the useful section and kind of where to go find these things. Sometimes these things can be a little difficult to find, and so we're trying to make it easy to just zero right in. I think one of the takeaways for me that when you look at this is that you will see some design patterns that start to emerge across some of these. There's a lot of common things that are done that kind of spell them out a little different, but if you kind of look at them at a little more macro level, or you kind of blur your eyes, they start to all kind of look similar. So you see lots of things, and I think and I know Ken wants to say a few things on this one as well, but one of the things when Kent and I were talking earlier this week about this whole thing is, what we're seeing is that there's a lot of things that have been done historically in the software industry that are applicable in the IoT space. So there's a lot of best practices you can just carry forward if we can kind of make sure everybody's aware of what those are. There's a lot of lessons learned. I think those of us who have some scars from over the years of doing this know how to do these things better, from just the pain and anguish of doing it wrong. So if we can not do it wrong again, it would be helpful. I think everybody would be better off. But one of the other observations, and if you've played in the specs and standards, you'd probably know that the standards in this case aren't all that, I would say, they don't provide necessarily a cookbook or a recipe for exactly how to do this. It isn't like an instructable on the internet to go look up, oh, this is how I got to do it. They're often a lot more descriptive and not prescriptive, and so, even though it will talk about the capabilities, it won't tell you exactly how to do some of these things that we've been talking in the room on. How you make it necessarily scalable may not be spelled out in the standard. It will just say that you should be able to do a software update. Just assume then that you can make it scalable behind that, and you're thinking ahead. And what else? Yeah, so, and if you want to add anything there, Kent?
Yeah, the real focus is that what we're seeing is a lot of these standards aren't really, or a lot of these documents aren't really focusing on specific show and tell. In other words, how to do it precisely. And those that do, like, for example, the IEC document 62443-2 have some very specific things for a specific industry, in this case, industrial automation and control systems. So we're finding that there are some relevant capabilities documented out there, but most of them, from what we've seen, mirror what software vendors have been doing over the years. I mean, the software industry has been discovering and stumbling over these processes for years and years, as Justin mentioned. It's very accurate. There's been a great deal learned from what they have done in trying to step past the mistakes of the past and step into the future. The real question is, in a lot of these that we have gone through, it seems the IoT, quote unquote, space is focusing very much on best practices that are existing vendor practices from the software industry. So one of the questions is there really a difference between the techniques and processes of today versus for the software industry versus what IoT is going to be requiring in the future? And if so, maybe what we should be doing is trying to address really what that gap is, what those differences are, so that then we can really inform vendors and manufacturers alike.
Okay. And with that, I think we're kind of at the couple things. I think Kent and I would like a call for help. There's plenty of work to do. And so, if you want to help, we have a mailing list on the Google groups. We also have a Google Docs drive so that it's all easily to get there when Google Docs is working. And with that, questions, comments, discussion.
Great. See a couple of questions in here. Let's go Craig and then John.
Craig Spiesel, Online Trust Alliance, Internet Society. I think this is good. A few comments I want to make. And I think Kent made a point here is not to call all these standards. Standards have a very specific term meaning here. The second thing, and I have participated a little bit on this group here, I would segment this out and maybe even think of a grid. Some of them, of the activities listed here, are very, very focused. Some of them, for example, interoperability, technical standards, how devices are going to communicate with each other. Others are very much core security. Others, like our framework, includes also privacy. And I think even though the scope of this effort is patching, I think really provide as much utility, it'd be really good to perhaps flag or have a grid of kind of like what are these frameworks, what do these include. And there's another part of this is there's 3 dimensions to IoT. It's not just one size fits all. It's a physical device. How am I going to patch my device? How am I going to patch my mobile app that it works with? And or the cloud service behind it. And the reason I point that out is dependent upon this list here, some of them are looking at all 3, some of them are only looking at 1. So I think, again, visually that would be very helpful. You go down and you could identify those areas. So again, I think that would help take it to another layer to make it more useful of what's out there.
Yeah, Craig, I totally agree. One of the things that, shortfall in the document as it exists today is that we really haven't classified these into industry alliances or SDOs. We haven't done any real classification as to the applicability to any or all parts of the IoT space that needs to be addressed. And I think we do need to do that.
Okay, so Justin Kapos again.
Excuse me.
Yeah. So, like one thing I'll give offline is I'm happy to give you a few other standards documents that are very update focused and very specific about that. And that's like the whole purpose of the standard, is to have this, you know, massive discussion about how to do update security. And then I'm sorry I didn't catch the name of the gentleman who's calling in over the phone, but I thought he had a really nice question that he kind of ended with, which was the question of, well, what is different from traditional software update infrastructures? And since, you know, I've worked a lot in that space and kind of more recently came to the automotive space and tried to understand it from that context, we've been trying to understand not only what is different you know, from the server space to IoT, but also what's different from the automotive space to other things in IoT. And we've come up with a couple things that I'll kind of quickly say something about, but then could have a broader discussion. I don't know what the right area is, but some of the things that we've seen that's quite a bit different is that it seems in the IoT space, there seems to be a general consensus that everyone wants to be on the master or latest release of software that comes out. And while that's true with some things like, you know, Chrome and other software that you have that'll automatically update itself, it's very frequent that people will intentionally like pick and choose what software they update for their Linux distribution for the different packages in their environment and systems. So that's one difference that I believe is fairly pervasive across the IoT space. And I'd love to have people come in after I'm done saying my list and tell me that I'm wrong. Please tell me I'm wrong if there's things they don't know. In general, in the IoT space, it's not very important to coordinate updates between different devices, because usually devices you have in the home probably come from different vendors. And so you don't think of updating them as a collection, where a lot of times in traditional servers you do this. Certainly within a car, you need all the components of your vehicle to be able to talk to each other so that your brakes still work after you do your update. So that's another area that we saw was a bit different. There's also this question of who decides when devices update. And this was brought up earlier on. It was like a passing point of the consumer making this decision. But one thing that does happen in a lot of other contexts is that manufacturers will go and be the ones who decide they want, when you buy their device, you're also getting updates. We're going to fix security patches in your device for you. And I think that model is a model that is something that perhaps should be recommended in the case where you have an inattentive home user. If you have the informed, attentive home user who does want to manage their updates and do things like this, I can see the wisdom of allowing them to do that. But I think it's, from a risk standpoint, thinking about what would be worse overall for the security of the user, I think forcing every user to have to be an informed and attentive user is a recipe for disaster. The devices have very different capabilities, the weakest to the strongest devices. This was brought up very nicely before by Srinav. He mentioned that there's such a wide array of difference that some devices might not be able to do things like even check signatures or do other operations like that. And the final difference I have here on my little cheat sheet is it has to do a little bit with how you do updates and what the delivery mechanism is. Actually makes a very big difference, because at least in some Internet of Things environments, you're going to have a master-slave sort of relationship where you have a very, very weak device that is just sort of a dumb device that gets directly programmed. And while there are some parallels with this where, you know, for instance, your smartphone, you have things like the cellular chip and other things in there that you go and you directly apply firmware to, and there may not be the same level of verification that happens for the OS packages because it's stored separately. There is, I think, quite a broader range of differences for how people do this in IoT devices that doesn't commonly show up in desktop or other types of environments.
Wow, that's fantastic. Thoughts, comments? Dan.
Thanks, Alan. Dan Caprio with Providence Group. I've been involved a little bit with this group, so I just want to point out there's an effort that's beginning, or it's underway, but I think officially beginning tomorrow on the civil society side, led by the Center for Democracy and Technology, and they're beginning to look at some of the same issues and some of the same frameworks. So we ought to make sure that we're plugged in to what CDT is doing, and that we're all aligned and not reinventing the wheel. So I'm happy to help with that.
Fantastic, thank you.
Dan, that's exactly what I was referring to without disclosing that, but agree.
I misunderstood, Craig.
No, when I made that comment about the earlier comment about segmenting and such things, so the level of detail is very specific. For example, consumer notice, consumer choice, very much in a checkbox, what framework has that. So it goes into a much greater level of effectively what are the principles within it, the FIPS in a sense, in that area. And so I think it's going to be a very helpful document.
Okay, good.
Thoughts in particular about sort of this difference between software and connected devices? Kent, do you have thoughts on this? Oh, that was fantastic.
Well, just a quick point. Joseph has reached out to us and in fact, actually contributed entry to the catalog as well. This is a heads up. So there is communication going on.
Thanks. And I have to apologize, Justin. I keep saying your name wrong, and we'll make sure we get it right. On the phone, we have Jim Mann.
I had originally chimed in to talk about one of the groups I think was missing on the slide that I saw, which is Trusted Computing Group. They have an IoT work group that's active right now and actually looking at some of the update best practices and so forth. So I think it'd be good to include that in there as well. And then also want to respond to Justin's comments about the updates and customers. I think he was talking about customer control of updates, and certainly in the traditional IT space, PCs and servers and so forth, we have commercial customers who definitely want to control if and when they take something like a BIOS update, right? In the consumer space, less so, but I think certainly when we start talking about industrial and commercial IoT space, I think we're going to want to see that kind of control over if and when they take a particular update so that they don't impact their operations.
Yeah.
Great, I agree.
He's nodding. And I think one of the things that we talked about at the initial meeting that kicked off this event was how to scope this around IoT. And I don't think there was a very clear consensus around saying limiting it to very particular sets of devices or applying it to everything. I think there's strong cases in both directions. One dividing line that might be useful is it centrally administered or not? Because there are things that are slightly industrial but still will be fairly autonomous in their administration, and there are going to be things that look consumer, but they're going to be in a context where there's going to be a third-party organized administration power. Anyone have some great organizations that we should be adding to this list? Or folks that we should be reaching out to who can point us to people who are engaged in this list?
Ralph's got his hand up.
Ralph.
Yeah, this is Ralph Brown with CableLabs. Just saying again, CableLabs probably should be on this list. With respect to the observation that most of these organizations don't provide a cookbook or detailed specification for how software updates should take place. In case of CableLabs, our specifications are very detailed, precisely what needs to be done, what needs to be implemented, and in fact, we test and certify devices in compliance with our specifications. So in fact, we are assured that the devices, when they go in the field, actually implement the secure software download processes we've identified and specified.
We definitely want to add those to the catalog, no question.
All right, Craig?
Yeah, there's been a few comments about some of them haven't been extremely prescriptive, and I can say that for our framework, that was by design. It was principle-oriented so that they're evergreen. The challenge is if we're very specific on how to do something today, the document will be out of date next week. And so, I mean, that's a fundamental discussion of is that good or bad? But again, principle-oriented, for example, I'm going to just make this up randomly. The patch should be encrypted or secured by current standards and protocols, but not specific. And that's by design, and then it can point to others. So I wouldn't necessarily throw out any of them that don't have that level of specificity on that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think in our history, we've evolved what we've done in terms of our specifications. We've been through 6 generations of cable modem specifications, and every time we have increased and kept pace with what were the best practices of the security, practices over time. We've also looked at, we operate a PKI to support that, and we've had to learn how to evolve the PKI and how we manage and operate it to, again, follow best practices for that. So you're right, it's something that has to evolve and will continue to evolve, but so being overly prescriptive is probably problematic.
Got Dan in the room, and then Jason on the phone, and then Jamie in the room.
Thanks. It also occurred to me, I was in Brussels last week working with the European Commission on the Internet of Things, and the Europeans about 1.5 years, 2 years ago have launched what they call the Alliance for the Internet of Things, and they've done an awful lot of similar work. So again, I'm kind of raising my hand to volunteer for this, but we need to be continuing the transatlantic and the global engagement, but making sure that we're capturing similar efforts that are taking place in Europe.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And I should also add that when our colleagues, our government colleagues from around the world come to the United States, IoT security is something that they're interested in talking about, and they're very interested in the work that all of you are doing. So I think if we can demonstrate that this is a successful project, it is a chance to sort of help influence a lot of these discussions around the world. Jason on the phone.
Yeah, this is Jason Walls from QA Cafe. I work with the Broadband Forum, and the discussion has kind of moved from what I was originally going to say, so I have a slight list. First was definitely with the list that Justin is making. I just want to reiterate that it'd be great to get him involved so that we can kind of get that information. One of the other things that is a difference that I think that can benefit from standardization, or at least input from standardization bidirectionally, is that a lot of the devices are going to be proxied, right? So there's going to be the thing that is controlling their updates. They might not be directly communicating with it. It might be being done by some other intermediary hub or other kind of smart hub situation. And yeah, I just wanted to reiterate about the prescriptivity. Obviously, if you haven't had a look at the Broadband Forum stuff yet, that's sort of the line that we've been going down very specifically. And just like, like Ralph said, the service provider and MSO and cable communities have been dealing with this exact situation when it comes to sort of bigger things like home gateways and in their case, e-routers and cable modems and such. And so the similarity we're asking about, are we just trying to get the best practices from software? It's the best practices from the people who've been doing, end device updates and end device security that I think will be helpful.
Thanks. Jamie.
Hi, so I'm Jamie Brown with CA Technologies. Bringing it back to the software side, we're members of an organization called SafeCode, which is an organization made up of several software and beyond that now other types of organizations that promote secure development. SafeCode has a number of technical guidance documents on patching, on secure development that we think would be appropriate here. And they recognize, I know the board members and the leadership there, sort of the overarching importance of IoT, and I think are starting to guide a lot of the documents in that direction. So we'd be happy to put the working group leaders in touch with SafeCode leadership to see if we could get those added as appropriate.
Craig.
I want to just reiterate Dan's comment about the global aspect. It's not only what they're doing in Europe, I think is very important, but when we think about the rest of the world's view on data security and privacy, that the regulatory landscape and the norms in Europe are much different, and so we need to be thinking globally in what's appropriate in all these areas here. And we've talked about that before in many of the working groups on IoT privacy, transferability of the data and ownership of the data and such. So I think that's just an important part that we not lose sight of. There was an interesting article yesterday in the Wall Street Journal that talked about how companies in the U.S. are now focusing on GDPR because they expect that to be the norm for the U.S. So just thoughts on that aspect there.
I don't want to sort of fork this conversation to a GDPR discussion, if at all possible. But is there any response on that front? So in terms of next steps, Matt?
Next steps, I think we're looking for more help. And I think I know we're gonna continue to build out that catalog, and I think we got a few more volunteers to go with some of the specs to help us flush it out. And I don't know what else we have planned, Ken.
Yeah, no, I think this has been very helpful, both from the standpoint of access as well as potential volunteers. But over the last few days since this has gone out, we have received, like I said, additional input to the catalog, which is very much appreciated, and we'll look forward to being able to add those that were referenced here. Thanks.
Question for Kent and Matt. In terms of sort of the document that you're going to be producing, can you tell us a little bit about what that might look like or what the target audiences of that would be? How do you see, where are you aiming this?
Well, that's a good question, and that's one that I think we need to have a discussion around. Internally, we've had a discussion that the document was really sort of an outgrowth of our research. We didn't want a whole bunch of people going after the same groups, so we initially used it as a means to sort of self-deconflict, so to speak, some of the research. There's a lot of research to be done here. We don't need people wasting time doing something that someone else has already done. In the process of doing that, we have, in essence, been able to create this this beginning catalog, so to speak, as to the efforts that are out there, some of the documents that are out there, as well as we're using this as a means to sort of get to the point where we can communicate to the other working group leads as to what documents they may find most useful for their efforts. The question is, this is taking a good deal of time from our standpoint to do all of this research, and as we today learned, there's probably another 5 or 6 different resources we need to add to the emerging research side. So it depends on what we're trying to accomplish, and that's part of the discussion I think we have to have. This was initially done to make sure we weren't reinventing the wheel in what we produced. At this point, I think this is something that could be very useful internally. But I think also because of the amount of work that it's taken us to get here, and it has been substantial, that this could be beneficial as a point-in-time reference for others who either involved with this effort or not involved with this effort to be able to use. But I'm not sure what form it would be published in directly. That's something we can discuss.
Excellent. Srinath.
Yeah, the similar effort has been made by the Smart Grid Interoperability Panel, SGIP. They created a kind of a catalog of standards. They have gone through some of the list, whatever we are seeing here, they have gone through all the list standards, and they created a kind of a catalog. So if we can refer to that, of course, some of the new things are there. We can follow the format of that particular catalog where they say, okay, these are the highlight point of this one, these are applicable to us, and there is a gap. So if we can identify those things and put it in our, whatever the document we are talking, that would be helpful to others, I think.
Is that catalog public?
I think it's on the SGIP website. I can check and refer that back to you.
Connect with you because that could be a very rich data source for the working group.
I will check.
Standards to read through.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. There's a gap analysis that comes out of that is being mentioned. I think mapping it potentially into a framework as mentioned, for the IoT might be beneficial, and then potentially even looking at what are the common design patterns across all of these so that you can kind of summarize it so that somebody can do a quick read and figure it out and then drill down as they need to go.
Yep.
I agree. I think this is, the work you're doing is going to be of tremendous value, not just to this initiative, but it's going to be, I think, foundational for private efforts. And of course, I've been talking with some of our government colleagues about the importance of this is knowledge that would be really useful. We can say, hey, NTIA's stakeholders, they're doing the work, and we'll have to, means that we get to loop you guys into all those discussions.
Right. So it sounds like we gave ourselves a bunch of homework assignments.
And we will make sure that when the notes go out that we have a very explicit call for making sure we have the full range of standards, but also calls for volunteers for people to analyze and do some of the work on that front.
I did see a lot of hands going up that want to volunteer, so that's good. Great.
Thank you, Matt. Kent, any last words?
No, other than I'm sorry I wasn't able to be there today. I would much rather be there in person than on the phone.
Thank you. So any last comments on the standards question? All right, we are slightly ahead of schedule, which is always good news. So now we have the third working group. We're going to pivot from the primarily tech focus to both the technical aspect, but also the policy and usability side on the consumer focus. And we've got Harley. Do we have this loaded? No. So if you haven't given us, if you haven't loaded it, then do you just want to use your machine? Either the machine. Yeah. Let's just probably just. We will see if it is actually easier to do a hot swap. Once saw 4 tenured professors, 2 of which had won Turing Awards, try to connect a laptop to a projector. Yes. All right. So while Harley is setting this up, after this discussion, we'll have a lunch break, and then we'll return to the final working group, and then we'll talk about sort of the big picture of where we're all going. Harley.
Good morning, everybody. So I represent the Communicating Upgradability and Improving Transparency Working Group. And what I'm about to present to you is a consensus document from that working group. And I want to emphasize that this is a product of the working group. We have roughly 25 members, including technologists, engineers, lawyers, and public policy specialists from private companies as well as civil society. And I want to especially call out and thank my co-chairs, Aaron Kleiner from Microsoft, Bo Woods from the Atlantic Council, who were not able to make it today, and also Megan Brown from Wiley Ryan and Craig Spiesel from OTA for exceptional participation, but this was a group effort and a lot of folks participated. So the first thing that we did was come up with a problem statement. What is it that we are trying to solve as a working group? And our problem statement was essentially that consumers have difficulty assessing the security of a particular IoT device without manufacturer communication. And this is, of course, as it relates just to updates. And then we came up with a mandate for the group, a mission. How will we address this problem? And we focused on what information manufacturers should communicate to consumers about IoT security updates. And we did this really before we got started on the elements that I'll be presenting. And we reached consensus on this as our mission. And honestly, we kept a militant focus just on this mandate. There was at various times a desire to perhaps talk about other IoT security issues, segmentation or privacy. And these are absolutely important issues, but they were not within the specific mandate that we were trying to fulfill. And so we did not address them. Now, in previous multi-stakeholder processes, issues of voluntariness, or whether the documents relate to legal standards, these were discussed at agonizing length. And we wanted, and the lawyers in our group especially wanted, this to be crystal clear about what the document was and what the document was not. So it is just the output of the multi-stakeholder process, and the output of our working group specifically, does not describe or supersede any regulation, domestic or international, and it is not intended to create a legal standard of care or future legislation or statutory obligation. And we put that right up on top in footnote 1 to dispel the preliminary terrors. Now, in addition, for the prevention of bewilderment and heartache, we also included important context in the intro and scope. Oh, by the way, just if you haven't noticed, on the bottom right-hand corner there are the page numbers. These follow along with the document that we have a hard copy out there. If you don't have a copy, it'll be helpful because we're going to go through the elements. But so in the intro and scope, we put in important context, such as that IoT methods, capabilities, deployments vary widely. They're incredibly diverse. And this is not intended to recommend exact language that manufacturers must use or specific vehicles. It's not, we mention a box label or a website, but manufacturers will have to choose the communications vehicle that is right for their own deployment and their customer needs. And we also wanted to make sure that folks that are reading the document don't get the impression that security updates are the silver bullet for IoT security. They are not. And that we acknowledge that it's just one security measure, does not offer complete protection. And then we also included some of the stuff that our working group as a whole reviewed. So we looked at existing standards, some of the things that FTC, DHS have already said. We drew on our own experience as members of companies or civil society, as well as our personal opinions in coming up with the list. I would also point out, just if you're reading the document, to note throughout the document the careful use of words like could or may or consider, because there was a big effort to be gentle, to make recommendations without being too prescriptive. And so this is the real meat of the document, starting on page 2. These are the elements that we suggest manufacturers communicate to consumers. And this section notes, it reiterates, that the communications are voluntary, that the elements can be communicated in a variety of ways, box label, website, etc., and that the communications can change, will likely change over time to match the evolving technology, evolving threats, and consumer expectations. And in drafting these elements, as you can see here, we wanted to, there was an effort to prioritize some elements over others. Some of them were more fundamental, we thought, to the issue of IoT security updatability than others. And so we broke them out into 2 categories with a temporal factor, which is important. You know, the key fundamental elements are ones that should be communicated to consumers prior to purchase. I shouldn't say should, could be communicated to consumers prior to purchase. Manufacturers should consider communicating to consumers prior to purchase. And then additional elements that could be communicated before or after purchase. And an example of a post-purchase communication would be an instruction manual. And part of this is not just one being more fundamental than the other. Some of this is also trying to account for different levels of expertise and savvy among consumers, because some of the additional elements may be things that somebody who's very technically savvy would really care about, but is not necessarily very fundamental to a broad range of consumers. Now there are 6 elements in total, 3 of each, 3 key elements, 3 additional elements. I'm going to go through them one by one, and then at the end I'll have a slide that has all of them together so we can review them. So this is the first of the key elements. It's the most fundamental, of course. Can the device, as a technical matter, receive security updates? And this can appear as a simple statement. It can appear as a checkbox, yes or no. And the second key element, a summary description of how the device receives updates. And part of the point of this is to give the consumer some sort of an indication about what level of effort, what kind of commitment does the consumer need to anticipate in buying the device. Are the updates automatic? Is there a manual option? Will you have to pay a mechanic's fee or some extra fee in order to get security updates? These are the things that you don't want to find out after you've already bought the device and you find out, I have to go to a specialized mechanic who will charge me a fee every time that I want an update. And this is the last of the three key elements. When does security support end? And so a specific date is preferable because a range like 1 year will not necessarily account for the amount of time that a device sits on a shelf. And it can be unknown. It can be indefinite, in which case we recommend that manufacturers consider communicating that to consumers. We don't know when it's going to end, or it's indefinite, or the manufacturer perhaps will provide critical updates, but not necessarily routine updates. So that's the last key element, which manufacturers should consider communicating prior to purchase. And now we're on the second category of additional elements that can be communicated before or after purchase. And these are de-emphasized deliberately because we don't consider them to be quite as fundamental as the key elements. So the first additional element, how is the user supposed to know when there is an update? Is there a proactive indication, or does it take some sort of a user action to find out that an update is available? And this can be combined with A2, which was the how does the device receive updates. However, we thought that this particular component of how the device receives updates was important enough to be called out sort of on its own here in the additional elements. The second additional element, what happens when the device no longer receives an update? So when the light bulb reaches its end of security support, does it continue to emit light? Right? Can you still control it with your phone? Does it lose functionality? Is there an official means for users to continue to receive updates? Perhaps an extended subscription fee, or does the user simply continue to operate an unupdated device or unsupported device at their own risk? And then the last of the three additional elements, how does the manufacturer secure the updates? Is there a way of verifying the source of the updates? Is the update tested to make sure that it preserves functionality with other devices, or that it doesn't create new security problems? And here we call out specifically that the manufacturer maybe doesn't describe at great length how the device's updates are secured. The manufacturer can also reference a standard. So the devices are secured, the updates are secured compliant with X standard. So those are the 6 principles, the 6 elements. And we'll look at them all in a moment, but first I wanted to call out a potential additional work. And these are examples of communications on IoT security updatability. And we tried this. We tried to find examples that are currently being used in the wild by other companies, and we really didn't find anything that was on point enough, which we take to be a good sign, actually, that despite the sort of numbing plethora of standards that are out there, this still fills a gap. So we couldn't find anything there. And then we tried some theoretical examples, just ones that we made up, like how would the key elements look perhaps on a box label. But we also thought that this might distract from the content. So really we only had one, and then one that was pretty abstract. And so it's a potential area of work. This could go in a number of different directions. Perhaps we will just come up and spend a lot of time coming up with different theoretical examples, or what would be really awesome is if we could get a company to work with us on perhaps applying these principles to a product or several products, and then we can use those real-life examples. That would be great. So here is the review of the elements that our group reached consensus on. And now I'd like to open it up for QA for feedback. So we'd ultimately love to have this as to reach consensus on these and on the document itself from the larger multi-stakeholder body, not just from the working group. So let us know what you think, either now or later, please.
I think it was great work of the group. I just want to kind of give a few caveats. these may seem very broad, but by design they would, because they need to be. How you do it, provide appropriate notice to these can be very limited. For example, on a fitness tracker, you have what you're constrained on the box size versus a 65-inch TV. We went through a lot of those scenarios. I think one point that I feel is very important, though, and I know there's some debate with the FTC, is well, notice should be on first use. And I've been very opinionated that if you buy a TV, you haul it up to your home, you mount it on the wall, that should not, and when you turn it on, that should not be the time you find out that, by the way, patching costs X or we don't support it in there. And so I think it's very important that this notification be transparent and easily accessible for a user prior to product acquisition. And that was one of the points that we, I think, pointed out to. I think the second thing is, ideally, these are minimum. We want to see companies compete on these areas. And really, and a company might say, we're committed to 5 years of support or 10 years of support. And that's great. But again, we're being very careful not to say what that period is. So I think it's an opportunity for companies to really differentiate their product and compete on privacy and security. So thank you for your work and leadership on the committee.
Yeah, this is Ralph again. I think, I agree. This is really important work. And appreciate the difficulties in terms of crafting these kinds of outlines or suggestions. One thing that I think comes back to the question of scope for this particular effort is we acknowledge that security patches and updates one piece of the bigger picture. And so while this talks to that piece, there's a question about, does that convey to the consumer more than it actually means, right? Does it give them a false sense of security because you may get security patches, but your privacy is totally wide open or something like that, right? So is there something that should be added to this, or is some way to think about how this is caveated, for lack of a better term, to indicate what is actually conveyed by this?
Well, so the document itself does note, of course, that this is just one narrow slice of sort of the range of security issues that and privacy issues that are attendant to IoT. And I mean, we also thought that something like privacy or segmentation, encryption, et cetera, that these are not necessarily within scope of a multi-stakeholder process on updatability. Now, if what you're saying is that that we should build into the elements an instruction to manufacturers that they should communicate to consumers on privacy, we thought that was out of scope.
Maybe less that than consideration. Companies should give consideration to either explaining other security aspects that they provide, or stating that this addresses this specific narrow topic. Because you are defining by fact of saying this is our scope, we're leaving all of that out. You leave all of that subject to interpretation by the consumer, and it would seem that you would want manufacturers to have some statement about that is out of scope and we don't address it, or we do address it in this way. So I don't know, not being a lawyer, know exactly what language you would want to use, but it seems to me that there should be guidance to manufacturers to be explicit around that.
Also, well, first of all, I would strongly urge against using legal language in a label like that. And perhaps the CDT, the gentleman has left, but the CDT process will cover this. But we want to be very careful not to tell manufacturers what they should or should not say. We're not going to tell them you should communicate to consumers an additional statement about privacy, and because then if you're telling them you should communicate something about privacy, then you start to get into what should they say about privacy? Which issues should they cover? And we did not want to deviate from our scope.
So what do you tell the consumer that you say, hey, this was giving me security updates and my privacy is exposed?
Craig?
Well, again, it was a scope of, by definition, set forth by NTIA. This is about patching and supportability. The Online Trust Alliance, we create a very specific framework that has 37 principles that outlines the very specifics at what's required. So again, that's outside of scope of what NTIA is doing, but there's other efforts that we think that are minimum requirements of disclosures and transparency to address privacy, ownership, transferability, as well as security and patching. So again, outside the scope of what's in this room, as I understood it, and Alan, correct me if I'm
We also
wrong.
did though reference a few standards, OTAs, and I think at least one or two more in the document, saying in our intro and scope where we mention, call it explicitly that other issues are not necessarily discussed except for security updatability. We did say that information on these sources can be drawn from, for example, the OTA framework, and I think at least a couple of others. So that's going to be up to manufacturers, and I almost think that that's a separate process.
Harley?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I have a couple of points. So I really like this. I think this is really good work. I really like this document. I just want to say that up front. I wonder if, this is very, very briefly almost touched on in 8.2, but I feel isn't called out strongly enough, is I think having some communication about the expected delivery mechanism, and in particular things like the size of updates and what this means is very important. Microsoft has gotten a lot of flack from consumers, especially those who pay for their bandwidth due to the large update sizes for Windows 10. And they're not unique in that regard. So I think this is something consumers care about in a lot of contexts, and I think would be a nice addition. And then,
now let me ask your opinion. So do you think that belongs in 8.2? Do you think that it's fundamental enough that it's something that consumers should know? Like, is it as fundamental as manual or automatic, or whether there's a fee? Is it something they should know before purchase, or do you think this is an additional element?
Effectively, I think it's a fee, but it's a fee of a different type. And I think it's something that belongs in an A number, and I don't know if I don't think it belongs in, it could belong in A2. In fact, when I originally read A2, just the title, that's what I thought you were going to be talking about. But here, what you're really talking about is almost entirely what does the user have to do to receive security updates, not how does the device itself receive, like what's the mechanical process between its receipt of the updates.
Right.
So if I were tempted to do it, I would probably just break them out into separate points. Mm-hmm. But I think they're both A points.
And is there a way of distinguishing, do you think, and I'm sorry for focusing on this, but you're right there. Is there a way of distinguishing updates that are large enough that's a problem? Like do you call them significantly large updates, or is there a generally accepted size limit where it's like, wow, now this starts to eat up a lot of memory?
So it really depends, because it can vary a lot even for a device, depending on some devices. When they do differential updates are very small. Some switch from full updates to differential updates over a period of time. So I think that what a consumer considers to be costly isn't actually necessarily, but trying to focus on that, isn't necessarily exactly dependent on, it's dependent on things that are outside of your knowledge and control, in part because I don't pay per byte for my internet access, but if I had an ISP in certain parts of Europe, I would be paying for that. So for me, the fact that Windows, drains all my bandwidth and stuff like that, whenever it's going to do an update for quite an extended period of time, is not as big of a concern for me. Whereas for other people, it would be, and perhaps also there's things with, if it's done, you often don't want to do software installation or updates or watch things over your your cellular connection. You'd rather wait if you're on your phone until you're on Wi-Fi to do things, because otherwise, you have a data cap. So it really depends a lot on the exact setup that a user is going to have, and you might not be able to tell those things up front. The user may be the only one who knows.
I also note that this would probably get us outside the realm of security updates, right? They're bundled into a lot of other things.
Yeah, I think it's along the lines of what you could sort of argue that it's a cost, like it's a denial of service style, like a cost-based attack that's being, in some ways launched by this device that the users let on their network. So it is something the user's not expecting. It is something that a manufacturer is causing to have happen, but it wasn't an outside party. It was perhaps a poor design.
Matt?
Good points. Matthew with the Chamber, by the way. Thanks to you and your group for, I think, the simplicity of the elements here. A couple things, just to piggyback, if you will, off of Ralph's points, just so I think I understand him clearly, to be fair to him and the points I think you're trying to make. So I think one of the thoughts was in terms of what else might be left on the table in terms of what needs to be communicated, meaning, hey, this is one sliver of security. It's not the whole ocean. And then I think the thinking is of those other things out there to be managing risks, what else should be communicated? I think that's what I heard. And then part two is, does updatability automatically lead to privacy issues? And my impression is a lot of our members would probably say no, right? And I wouldn't necessarily want to leave that impression. I think I've got that right. Any thoughts there? Either one.
Yeah, so I just use privacy as an example. There could be others, right? I wouldn't state it that way. It's not necessarily trying to paint a landscape that would say to manufacturers, hey, you need to cover all these other topics about security as well in whatever you communicate to consumers. So that wasn't really what I was trying to convey. It was really trying to be more specific to suggest to manufacturers that they be clear about what they get with their security updates, right? That it does not answer all questions. And manufacturers, again, should be able to compete on saying, I go far above and beyond this because I take care of all these other security issues, and they should be transparent about that. Or they say, this is all we do. But because my concern is, by saying, if manufacturers start putting this language, then they're conveying to the consumer, we're dealing with security. You don't need to worry about anything else. And that is not true. So it's really important to be transparent to the consumer what you're actually getting with this. And that's the point I'm trying to make. It isn't necessarily it's an issue of privacy or other sorts of things. It's really trying to be clear about what this addresses. And that may be difficult, I agree, but it seems to me that there's an element of being clear with the consumer.
So in the introduction and scope language, and this is in the third paragraph, we do say that manufacturers may also consider advising consumers on these additional issues. So we are alerting manufacturers that are reading the documents or looking to this as a means of communicating with consumers that they should also consider other things besides just security updatability.
Right, but it doesn't raise to the level of being an element.
Yes, that's right. That's right, because otherwise it would be out of scope.
So this is Evelyn from NTIA. I just wanted to address the scoping issue that Craig had brought up. I mean, we have, I would say, learned from our multi-stakeholder processes that the more specific we can be, the more focused, the more successful they tend to be. And so we did intentionally want to keep this focused on the upgradability and patchability issues. And I think what Harley and his group has done is appropriate to stay within that window. We're not suggesting at all that there aren't other very important topics here that could also use some additional attention, but we, as I said, we have learned that that taking bite-sized steps sometimes is the best way to go. we are certainly open to talking about once this process has been underway and it looks like it's going in a good direction. What's next? Where do we need to go next? That's something that we look forward to the dialogue on. But and hearing from you all about what those other elements could be as well. But I do think for this particular process that the way that Harley and the group have scoped this is in our experience, a good way to go.
Thank you. I mean, honestly, like I said, we were trying to be militant about scope. This is how we got to consensus. Yeah. I think that if we had opened it up to a lot of other issues, important though they may be, it would have been a lot harder to get a group of 25 people from a variety of backgrounds to agree onto the document. You know, and so it does feel narrow, but I would submit that it actually significantly advances the conversation for consumers just to popularize a standard, in quotes, that perhaps manufacturers should consider communicating, A, whether the device receives updates, and B, for how long prior to the consumer purchasing the update. That doesn't exist now, and just those two elements alone, I think, significantly advance the ball.
Thanks. I wanted to go back to the point that you had raised about the incurring additional fees for data. Oh, sorry.
Sure. What's your name, by the way?
Megan Brown. I have helped on Working Group 3. I was looking at A2, and it seems to me that I think the concept you're worried about is sort of worked into that second bullet. I don't know that we had thought of it. When we talk about paying additional costs as a normal part, I think, you know, I don't think we had addressed that particular use case or situation, but that perhaps even tweaking pay to incur would cover that concept, because I think there's lots of situations where that could happen. I don't know that it's broadly of concern to a lot of consumers at the point of purchase, but I think the concept in the second bullet there is broad enough to cover that legitimate concern that you raise if manufacturers wanted to go that route.
Perhaps, and I think, you know, we're going to have a debriefing session as a working group, and I think that we will talk about potential ways to incorporate that suggestion, and perhaps one way to do it is in parentheses after the word costs there, say things like you know, monetary, bandwidth, data, something like that, in order to address the point.
It's Craig Spizo, and I agree with Megan there. We've done some intercept retail studies with a large retailer, and I would say that consumers aren't asking those questions. So we have to be cautious of how much we think about, obviously, a Windows update, a major PC versus your smartwatch and things there. That's not what consumers are asking about. There is one point that I know we spoke about in the working group. We may have lost it, but we've said that updates should not override user preferences or settings. And to the point that someone asked about privacy. So if I have my device configured a certain way, the updates should not override those. And I think that's important, whether it's a privacy setting or others. So that should be a should not or a must not. And if there's an exception, then it should be certainly the consumer should be flagged to reset their settings. So I point that out because I will tell you that I found multiple devices, including my cable provider, have pushed out updates, and I have found, whether intentional or not, my settings have been set to default settings. So I think that's an important part that we need to kind of perhaps highlight back in, and I apologize for not catching that earlier this week on our call. It'd be interesting if anyone else has any points of view on that topic.
I think we spoke about it. I seem to recall the suggestion. I think we did speak about it earlier on in the process. I mean, obviously this has taken several months, and I would only, I don't remember the specific conversation around it. I would only take the fact that it's not in the document as an indication that we were not able to achieve consensus on it within the working group.
Can I add a point?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, just to address the stuff. When we say updating a device means there must be a access condition needs to be considered. In the sense, it's a stepwise update. It is not like go and updating the whole thing in the device. That means some of the layers you will be keeping. That's called configuration, calibration, or information of the device. Such things, you will never going to touch that. That requires a certain kind of an administrative rights to modify such things. Those things you lock that during the manufacturing of the device, or deployment of the device. The updates you will be doing only on the, like a firmware kind of a stuff that's a next layer. So this update, your software or firmware sitting in the device will have a multiple layers kind of a thing. So you will be allowed only to do certain layers only. So in that way you protect your configuration, calibration, and everything.
So one thing I'll add is that when you start getting into certain sectors that may be regulated, and I know there are a couple of auto or former auto people in this room, there's a lot of background about what users can do and what the manufacturer can do in response. So if you're going to include that in the document, I'd recommend either explicitly engaging with that community or being very aware of that as you describe what you want to talk about. Further thoughts, these 6 points? We like them? Oh, Justin.
Sure. I just have one more point to make about B3. So I like the concept of B3, and I have seen in that. So this is the idea of the manufacturer describing in detail about the security updates. I like the at a minimum of having the idea. I think that the example you brought up was, oh, we use this protocol, or effectively what it boils down to is we use the standards, which really in most cases means we kind of use this protocol. But it often doesn't give someone who's a very informed consumer, like someone who wants to do a security audit or someone who wants to really understand the process, the level of information they need to have in many cases, because they'll be, if you just tell me, oh, we just downloaded it over, over SSL, HTTPS, right? And that tells almost no information because, have you pinned the certificate? Have you, do you have your own way of doing key revocation? How do you handle these sorts of issues? Do you also additionally sign things with an offline key, or is it all just trust to the server? So what some update systems have done is when they go to release information about when they're secure and in what environments they're secure, they often have these nice tables that they put where they have lists of different types of attack vectors and different, people compromising different parts of the infrastructure. And then what they'll do is they'll go and they'll label and they'll show what the impact of those kinds of compromises are. And that will, someone who goes to deploy a system like that can also use that table and use that information to sort of describe to their consumers exactly what the outcome of this would be. And I'd be happy to point you at some examples of this, and if you wanted to put something like this as an example in there, I don't know if it's too specific. I know you've got a lot of people to agree with, but I'm just throwing that out there as a suggestion. If the committee's interested, I'd be happy to engage more.
So please do. Please send it to one of us. There's my contact info. You can send it to me. I will say that we did try to, so you're talking about a sort of an extreme end of the informed consumer use case, and we, recognizing that everybody from my mother to, to you are going to be buying connected light bulbs and connected toasters.
I won't, but yeah.
Recognizing that, we did try to account for that in the page 2. We said that for all of these issues, all of these elements, the ideal level of detail and method of communication may differ among manufacturers, buyer types, and so forth. And with the idea that we didn't want to go into for each element talking about, well, here's what the basic level of detail might look like, and here's the extreme level. Now, we might do that if we take on the additional work that I described of having examples. But for now, that's sort of on a shelf, and we are trusting manufacturers to know their buyers and know that if my mom is buying the light bulb, that they're not going to include the table with attack vectors because it will scare her.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Sounds good.
Now, a quick question. Like I said, one of the things that we're hoping to do as a working group, and we're gonna debrief and we're gonna internalize all of this feedback and see what changes, if any, we will make to the document. I'm hoping that the document itself, that there is not a sentiment among the larger multi-stakeholder group that despite tweaks that we may want to see here and there, that none of them are so critical that we can't say this document stands alone as something that we can agree on, right? If there is, please let us know, either again right now or anytime contact us.
So
Cool.
So I wanted to, before I wanted to sort of talk about in terms of if we can get some feedback from both people who've had some today, maybe some comments from folks who had a chance to read the documents but couldn't show up for the meeting. You like this idea as a freestanding document? How would you like to see it play with the rest of the work that's going on? And of course, we'll talk about this as a community this afternoon. Do you guys, as the group, have a sense? You've got a very complete draft here.
That's right.
Time to set it out in the world?
So I think that the larger multi-stakeholder body has yet to sort of talk about what the final product is going to look like for each of the working group's products. And so it's difficult to say, how our product fits into that larger product without having a clearer vision of what the final overarching product is going to look like. If I had to venture a guess as to what might make a good product for the multi-stakeholder body, it would probably be something that is, you take the 4 working groups, for example, and segment their work at the beginning of a document and then try to synthesize it together in a second part of the document. I will suggest that each of the 4 working groups, not just ours, but each of them, the work product that has been developed so far is good as a standalone document, right? Like the compendium of IoT standards, I think, is hugely valuable on its own without starting to complicate the document by, referencing other parts of other work that the other working groups are doing. And I would suggest the same for our document, that our document, yes, in its narrow place in the world that's saying, these are things that manufacturers should consider communicating to consumers, is valuable as a standalone. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't integrate it into a larger multi-stakeholder work product that comes later. But like I said, I think we have to talk about what that work product, that final work product, will look like. So yeah, I'm hoping to send it out into the world.
Sorry, thank you.
One more question. It sounds like you spent a lot of time with lawyers working on this.
I too suffer from that curse.
Is it worth at least adding some sort of disclaimer or a mention of risk and to the manufacturer and communicating with consumers in various markets to say something about risk and discuss your use of this product and risk of information or loss of information or
yes, but perhaps not in this document. Right? I mean, I'd be curious to know with greater clarity what you think that element would be, or how to work it in, and how it relates to security updatability.
Let me look at your document that you have published.
Yeah, please. Yeah, thank you.
Great.
We talked a little bit about that. I think it was yesterday, or it's a blur to me, Monday. But I think that, in general, there's much broader. It's not just patching. I mean, if you're concerned about risk assessment, there's a whole range of issues, and we're not talking about online risk anymore. We're talking about physical safety risk. So that's outside the scope of this. But if you're thinking about risk assessment, it's all those things. It's not just, are your disclosure appropriate, but the physical, the class action product issues, product liability. So IoT brings a whole new dimension as we think about these issues and as these devices attack other devices. So the risk landscape has certainly changed, and we've seen that already, whether it's bots attacking other devices and such there. So I think that's a much broader issue than any of these working groups, but I'll defer to Megan, who has had some call for discussion. Yeah.
Thank you, Greg. I think we did have a discussion about what the other kinds of things a manufacturer might want to talk about, and the list is potentially endless depending on what they want to say and what consumers want to hear. I am concerned that broad statements about risk when it comes to use of IoT devices would end up being, something like, if you don't update the device and if you don't do all these other things, which are prudent cyber hygiene for consumers to do, you use this device at your own risk, and they would end up being very broad. So I think there's a scoping issue. We talked about a lot of interesting things that manufacturers might want to say, but I think when it comes to this very narrow little slice of IoT, I think trying to recommend any discussion of risk between a manufacturer and the consumer is fraught and would weigh this process down too much.
And I question to what extent that doesn't occur already and whether it would really resonate with most consumers. Very informed consumers are probably going to know this already. And consumers who are not very informed, at least a lot of them, see disclaimers and vague legal language all the time and sort of ignore it. And this is intended to be something a little different than that.
All right.
Yeah, as much as I pushed on scope, I do want to say that I really think this is important work and this is great. So don't take my comments as being, negative in any way, shape, or form. I think it's great work. I think it's really important, and I think these are the kinds of things that manufacturers need to be stepping up to.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you saying that. And I will reiterate, because we are hoping to be able to say that we have consensus on the document from the larger multi-stakeholder body, please do tell us if you think that there is something critical about the document that that makes you think, well, no, I cannot agree to this. Go ahead and email us about it, even if it is only to flesh out your thoughts about it more specifically later. We will try to tweak it. We will internalize the feedback. We want to perfect the document, but we also do want to move forward with it. Great, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Harley, and thanks to everyone else who contributed in this working group effort. We have about 15 minutes left before a scheduled lunch break. There are two things. We can start in on the next working group presentation, or we can have a slightly longer lunch. Sense from the community about what you'd like to do.
Slightly longer lunch.
All right, so I'm going to ask a favor for those of you who are here in person, which is, since we are all together, and this is such a fantastic bunch that represents so many different parts of the ecosystem, I'm going to ask that during your lunch, in addition to finding a sandwich and checking your email, that you introduce yourself to someone that you do not know and just share a little bit about the work that you're doing, because a lot of the value that comes out of this is not just going to be the documents themselves, but how they're going to be used. And that's really going to come from the personal relationships that we forge as part of this process. So that's your feel-good notion to go off into lunch. We'll be reconvening at 1:45 Eastern Time. For those of you on the call, we'll keep the call, we'll start the call up again. Those of you watching at home, we'll be starting again. In the meantime, have a great lunch.
Alan, before everyone leaves the room, could I introduce myself and make a brief ad?
Let's hold off until the open discussion after lunch, Russ. Is that okay?
Okay.
Thanks. Thanks, Michael.